Welcome to the Conversations That Matter podcast. My name is John Harris. Got a few things to talk about today that are important. I'm excited. We're going to be talking to Chuck Baldwin, who is a pastor now, but also an author. He actually wrote a book on Romans 13. He's run for the presidency under the Constitution Party's banner. So want to get his take on this whole civil authority, Romans 13, Constitution debate. There's many facets to it, and I think it'd be great to pick his brain on some of those questions. Also, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the new social justice narrative that is emerging. You probably could have predicted it, but I'm going to take you through a few things just to show where it's popping up and how we should probably think about responding to it, because we do need to start thinking about this. I guarantee you, after the dust has settled on this COVID-19 stuff, we're going to see an aggressive push to claim that there's so many disparities that exist in minority communities as far as healthcare, and we're going to need to do something. We're going to need to do some redistribution of some kind in order to fix these inequities. And so we need to discuss that. We need to talk about what does this mean before we get there, because we know it's coming. We see the signs of it coming. So how should we respond? Let's at least get that conversation started. Before, though, we get to all that, I'm terrible at this. I usually forget to make announcements. I think, I should probably tell my audience something, and then I totally get absorbed in the topic and I forget to tell all of you. So a few things. Number one, there is a big episode coming either later this week or the beginning of next week, depending on how much I get done. I'm in the middle of a lot of stuff right now. I know some of you are, very, you're not busy. You have a lot of time on your hands because you were laid off. I'm not one of those people. In fact, everything is ramped up for me right now. So we'll see what happens. But I'm hoping at the end of this week, I'm going to have a bombshell episode to bring to you. And if you're interested in social justice movement, evangelicalism, Southern Baptist Convention stuff, I will say no more because I don't want to give it away. But you're going to want to check out that video that's coming. Also, if you have not subscribed on Facebook, not pressuring you to get a Facebook. I would never do that at this point with the way Facebook's been cracking down on it, even my material. But if you have one already and you have not subscribed, please consider... I guess it's not subscribing on Facebook. I think it's liking. If you have not liked the page, Conversations That Matter, go to the info section right below this video. If you're watching on YouTube or if you're listening on a podcast, it'll be in the info section wherever it is on the service you're listening to. Click that link and give me a like. Give me a review if you feel so inclined. But the reason I'm saying that is actually for your benefit, not for mine so much. I actually released a video last Sunday. I think it's like 11 minutes long on Resurrection Sunday and some reflections. And believe it or not, there is material I release on Facebook, on Twitter. I have some other social media outlets as well. And I have a Gab now. I have Minds. I'm experimenting with some alternatives, but I release stuff on some of those platforms. And you may not see it if you're just watching the YouTube channel. So if you're interested in that, go check out the Facebook page and like it. One other announcement here. Oh, yes. Submit questions. That's right. I told my patrons about this about a week ago, and we've had trouble nailing down dates, but we finally nailed one down. A.D. Robles and I, along with Josh Summer, I think all three of us are on the same page at this point. It's been one of those things. Two of us will get on the same page, and then the other one can't do it. And now all three of us are on the same page, I believe. For this Monday, we're going to be recording. I may release it later in the week. We'll see. But we're going to be doing a video on dating and marriage. You may ask yourself, why are we going to do that during this pandemic? Aren't there more important things to talk about? Well, maybe, but maybe not. Because, I was talking to my neighbor the other day, and I said, I said there'll be a baby boom probably in about 9 months. And he said, yeah, there also will be probably a divorce boom. And I hadn't really thought of it. But then I was talking to my dad, who's a pastor, the other day, and he was saying he's already starting to see signs of marriages, not necessarily in the church, but with people in the church telling him, I guess, about situations, people that they know that are now finally together because the pandemic has forced them to be together in quarantine, and they realize maybe they don't like each other as much as they thought, and they're looking to file for divorce. And I'm wondering if there's something to that. And so For the last few weeks, we've been trying to get together an episode on dating and marriage. And if you have questions on any of that, on relationships, please submit them. I generally will see comments. I try to, at least. I don't always see them, but comments on the YouTube channel. If you go to the Facebook page, you can leave comments there. You can message the Conversations That Matter on Facebook if you have specific questions about dating or marriage. It's a tricky subject, honestly. I think I changed or tinkered with my philosophy on that throughout my dating and courtship experience. I tend to, I'm giving myself away here, I tend to favor a courtship model more. So maybe you can ask a question about that. What's the difference between the two? And we can get into it. But I definitely have learned, now I'm married, what maybe a wiser way that I could have done some things was. And I'm sure AD and Josh have similar experiences, and hopefully we can bring the Word of God to bear on that discussion. So there's my advertisements, my announcements, and now let's get into the main thrust of this episode. I want to start by talking to you about the social justice push, and then we'll get into the Romans 13 and civil government stuff. But these were some videos. I've been seeing so many videos because it's a crazy world we're living in right now. But these were some videos I saw last week that came out of Philadelphia. I want you to watch this.
Public transportation. If you do not have a mask, you cannot ride public transportation, sir. Sir, you have to get off the bus. You have to get off the bus. Sir. Sir. You gotta get off the bus, man. I'm gonna have the cops take you off, one or the other. You have to get off, you have to get off, you have to get off. Let's go.
I have to get off?
Yes, sir.
Even though I have this?
You don't have no mask. Let's go. Let's go. You gotta get off. Let's go. Let's go. You gotta get off. Let's go.
With a taser? Let go, orange go. Take me.
As you can see, someone from the bus company gets on the bus and asks everyone to get off the bus if they don't have a mask. And for social justice warriors, it's important to note the skin color. So I don't usually do that, but in this case, it's going to be important for what we're about to talk about. So I will note the man is white. I don't know if he's Italian. I don't know exactly what he is, but he would be categorized in the mind of the social justice warriors as a white man, telling a number of folks, some of whom are minorities of various kinds, to get off the bus. And then he gets forceful. He goes to the back of the bus, and there's some folks back there, and they all have either, like a, from the video it looked like at least, clothes wrapped around their face, or one guy did have he had some kind of a scarf or something, and that wasn't good enough. And the one guy, the prominent kind of one in the front there, that's like, seriously, I have to get off the bus? Well, he's a black guy. he's a person of color, and he's getting discriminated against, if you want to put it that way, because he does not have a mask from this white representative of the bus company. And so then the next video you see, and these were connected, so I'm assuming this is the same bus or the same city. It's got to be Philadelphia. It's in the same tweet that went out. Some policemen, white guys again, dragging this black guy off the bus, and I muted some of those clips because there was some language in it I didn't think you needed to hear, but he's very angry. And one of them even takes his phone and just throws it on the ground, which to me is just amazing that, a police officer would do that. But I mean, they're purposely trying to stick a needle in this guy's eye. Now, under normal circumstances, I just want to ask you, what would be the reaction from the social justice warrior crowd? What would be the reaction under normal circumstances? Wouldn't that video be played on the news, maybe even national news? Wouldn't that be like a national outrage? We'd probably be hearing about it. But because it's COVID-19, that doesn't even make the headlines at all. It probably didn't even make the local headlines in Philadelphia. It was a fairly unpopular tweet that I happened to stumble upon. And so why do I bring that up? I bring that up because I want to make a point about a few things. Number one, for those who are very serious about racial inequities, discrimination, all the things that social justice warriors claim to care about so much, for those who are very serious about that, the thing that you'd think they should be the most concerned with right now, and this includes evangelicals who are on the social justice train, they should be concerned about government overreach right now. You'd think that would be the biggest thing that they'd be screaming about. I mean, if Russell Moore can hold Caring Well conferences with the ERLC and they promote their abused victims, and our job is just to listen. We just need to listen. That's it. That's our only job. And pastors need to learn from these victims because they're going to tell us how to handle abuse. If that's the way that we treat abuse in the church, and we do this across the board with all the different victim groups that evangelicals and the broader social justice movement want to platform. If that's how we do it, what about victims of state overreach? What about pastors who have been discriminated against because of the authorities coming in and then ticketing all their members for showing up at a drive-in church or something like that? What about that? What about Rodney Howard-Browne? I talked about him last episode. Shouldn't we then put them on the conference circuit and we should all just listen, right? Because they were discriminated against by another hierarchy, the government. And let's make matters now even more easy for the social justice crowd. Now you have, in the video I just played, you have white police officers treating a black man on a bus this way. Shouldn't we all be up in arms about that? But I'm not seeing it. At least not yet. I'm not seeing that kind of outrage. In fact, I'm seeing the opposite. I'm seeing people scared for their lives and for the lives of others, and upset when someone doesn't wear a mask or when someone is careless and negligent. And it's just our duty to comply no matter what. So I want to point this out. I think this will be important to remember this in the future. Now, I say that to say this. The Surgeon General put out a video it wasn't him that put it out, it was the administration put it out, but he spoke on camera during a press briefing last week. I want you to listen to what the Surgeon General had to say. Here we go.
At the President's direction, yesterday I met with 2,000 Hispanic leaders from their communities, and today the Vice President led a phone call that I was on with hundreds of African American leaders, including the Reverend Jesse Jackson, including Derek Johnson of the NAACP, including the National Medical Association and the Black Nurses Association, to talk about some of the alarming trends we're observing regarding the impact of COVID-19 on communities of color. And you've heard the stats in New York City. Hispanics represent the majority of deaths. In Milwaukee County, blacks are 25% of the population, but almost 50% of the cases and 75% of the deaths. So what's going on? Well, it's alarming, but it's not surprising that people of color have a greater burden of chronic health conditions. African Americans and Native Americans, develop high blood pressure at much younger ages. It's less likely to be under control and does greater harm to their organs. Puerto Ricans have higher rates of asthma, and black boys are 3 times as likely to die of asthma as their white counterparts. As a matter of fact, I've been carrying around an inhaler in my pocket for 40 years out of fear of having a fatal asthma attack. And I hope that showing you this inhaler shows little kids with asthma all across the country that they can grow up to be Surgeon General one day. But I more immediately share it so that everyone knows it doesn't matter if you look fit, if you look young, you are still at risk for getting and spreading and dying from coronavirus. The chronic burden of medical ills is likely to make people of color, especially, less resilient to the ravages of COVID-19, and is possibly, in fact, likely that the burden of social ills is also contributing. Social distancing and teleworking, we know, are critical, and you've heard Dr. Birx and Dr. Fauci talk about how they prevent the spread of coronavirus, yet only 1 in 5 African Americans and 1 in 6 Hispanics has a job that lets them work from home. People of color are more likely to live in densely packed areas and in multi-generational housing situations, which create higher risk for spread of a highly contagious disease like COVID-19. We tell people to wash their hands, but a study showed 30% of the homes on Navajo Nation don't have running water. So how are they going to do that? In summary, people of color experience both more likely exposure to COVID-19 and increased complications from it. But let me be crystal clear. We do not think people of color are biologically or genetically predisposed to get COVID-19. There is nothing inherently wrong with you, but they are socially predisposed to coronavirus exposure and to have a higher incidence of the very diseases that put you at risk for severe complications of coronavirus. But as the Vice President shared on the call this morning, this history, and I want you to hear me say this, it does not have to be our nation's future. We're taking steps now in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic to reach, protect, and strengthen all communities impacted by this disease, and especially our communities of color. More details will be forthcoming, but we are actively working, as the Vice President and the CDC Director laid out today, data collection, targeted outreach to communities of color, and increasing financial, employment, education, housing, social, and health supports so that everybody has an equal chance to be healthy. And I want to close by saying that while your state and local health departments and those of us in public service are working day and night to help stop the spread of COVID-19 and to protect you regardless of your color, your creed, or your geography, I need you to know you are not helpless. And it's even more important that in communities of color, we adhere to the task force guidelines to slow the spread. Stay at home if possible. If you must go out, maintain 6 feet of distance between you and everyone else, and wear a mask if you're going to be within 6 feet of others. Wash your hands more often than you ever dreamed possible. Avoid alcohol, tobacco, and drugs. And call your friends and family. Check in on your mother. She wants to hear from you right now. And speaking of mothers, we need you to do this, if not for yourself, then for your abuela. Do it for your granddaddy. Do it for your big mama. Do it for your pop-pop. We need you to understand, especially in communities of color, we need you to step up and help stop the spread so that we can protect those who are most vulnerable. This epidemic is a tragedy, but it will be all the more tragic if we fail to recognize and address the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 and an array of other diseases and risk factors on communities of color. The task force and this administration are determined not to let that happen. The President, the Vice President have said we will not let that happen. We can't fix these issues overnight, but I promise you we will work with your communities to quickly and meaningfully move the needle in the right direction. Nothing less than the fate of our families and friends. My family and friends depends on it.
So this is the new narrative. There's disparities. There's the pre-existing conditions are caused because of the environment that people of color live in, and now we need to address them. Now is the time. So this is unrelated in some ways to COVID-19, but we're taking now the opportunity of COVID-19 to say, I'm from the government. I'm here to help. He even said, if you feel alone, don't feel alone. You're not alone. Because why? Because the government's here. And the government is going to be, the federal government, again, where this is coming from, is going to be the one to solve these problems, these inequities. And so, it's funny to me. I've seen so many things, I can't keep track of them, but we're shooting ourselves in the foot because, I saw there was I forget what city it was in, but it was a Whole Foods store, non-essential. Whole Foods shut down. Whole Foods even responded, we're non-essential, but Walmart is essential. So you're purposely now making a choice for people on where they can go and get something to eat, and you're going to make them get the option that's not as healthy because we're non-essential. I saw a dad playing ball with his daughter in Colorado. Wife sitting on the bench. Police come up, ignore social distancing guidelines, arrest the dad for playing ball with his daughter. In New York City, I saw, I think it was a married couple. They're sitting on, it was like a bench area, and police officer comes up. You need to separate. And they're saying, seriously, we're married. You need to separate. I mean, these stories are coming out all over the place. And I don't hear the evangelical leaders that we're supposed to trust even talking about them. To Al Mohler's credit, finally, I think it was like Friday night or Saturday, he spoke up in strong terms, against what was happening in Louisville. I mean, he didn't support Rodney Howard Brown at all, even spoke out against really what Rodney Howard Brown was doing in his case. But then when it's in his backyard, when the government is singling out drive-in services, he spoke out. And I'm glad he did. Better late than never. I also noticed, side tangent here, I also noticed on his Ask Al Anything, it was like a T4G special live stream. I think it was a couple nights ago. But he sort of endorses Trump using like it was like many paragraphs to do it. He didn't just say, I support Trump. He like did a whole thing. And yeah, you could tell he was nervous about it, but he did. And he really was speaking up against Democrats. And it's the same question that's always been in my mind about Al Mohler. Why don't you talk about what Russell Moore's doing? Why don't you talk about your own backyard? Thabiti Anyabwile and Walter Strickland and Jarvis Williams, and the list goes on. You know, why are you so against the national Democrats, but the ones that you actually have control, you have some influence on, you don't publicly denounce some of what they do? And I could go on a big tangent about that. I'm not going to, but all that to say, I will put credit where credit is due. Al Mohler came out against what was happening in Louisville, Kentucky, but it's silence for the most part from most big evangelical leaders. They're not talking about this police state that's being set up right in front of our eyes in many municipalities and states. It's just not even on their radar. I went to the coronavirus in the church thing, the Ed Stetzer thing. And, there's advice there on how to shake someone's hand, alternatives to handshaking. Real helpful, guys. Nothing that I could find there on government overreach, concern about any of the things that I just mentioned, the things I've been talking about for now about a month. So this is where we are, though. But here's the thing. The concern, though, even though you'd think the police state would be something to be concerned about, the concern they actually have is, and we're going to see this more and more, the disparities. The social justice train is just hitching itself to this. Let me show you some examples of that real quick. We got, before I go any further, the Surgeon General. So on March 4th, Ed Stetzer says, this morning, I met with the Surgeon General, and during the meeting, I asked him how churches might be preparing. Here is a story based on that conversation, including the significant news that church should limit hand-to-hand contact. So he does this whole thing in Christianity Today with the Surgeon General, who we just watched. And then the exchange with Ed Stetzer, advice for churches from the Surgeon General, preparing your church for coronavirus. And he posts. So they know each other somehow. There's a relationship there, and I'm wondering who influenced who. And part of the reason I say that, I've already showed you where Ed Stetzer's really big on this we got to stomp out this anti-Asian racism that's going on right now. He said it in multiple places. But I noticed, and I stumbled on this. I wasn't looking for it. I was doing research on something else. But Ed Stetzer has written for Sojourners, like not once, but like multiple times. Sojourners, if you don't know, that's Jim Wallace's organization. Jim Wallace, essentially, he admits this himself. I'm not putting words in his mouth. He said this in an interview in 2010. He said when he was in the student movement during Michigan State University in the 60s, he was a communist. He says this. And in 1979, this is after he was a Christian, he received Christ, he says, at the age of 6, and got born again, all of that. And then he basically loses his faith because of influence of teachers in high school, things he read in college, looking at the inequities around him in Detroit, which he says was the most segregated area of the United States. I'm sorry, indulge me this tangent real quick because I've been reading up on Jim Wallace. So Jim Wallace goes through this transformation, rejects Christianity, goes with the New Left, becomes an operative in the SDS, Students for Democratic Society. He gets arrested multiple times. He organizes protests, and then he gets disillusioned with it and comes back to the Christian faith. But he says that he had fresh eyes when he came back, and he brings all his New Left ideas with him. And he didn't understand the whole gospel until he finally read the Bible with fresh eyes, which you wonder, so what happened when you were 6? Were you saved or not? Because you didn't understand the gospel back then, but I digress. So he starts the Post-American first, and then it becomes Sojourners in, I think, 1975. And 1979, this is after all of that, he says it's a missions magazine, and I have the source. He says that basically he's looking forward to the day when the church, he predicts that there's a day coming, and he's looking forward to it, that the church will be able to look at the world through Marxist eyes, essentially, and that the young evangelicals are going to bring this in. And so he weds Marxism, he weds the new left ideas that he adopted during his high school and college years with the Christianity he had when he was young, and creates this new synthesis. And that's Sojourners. And he's extremely ecumenical. He doesn't think that, Catholics and Protestants and Reformed and Arminians and mystics and go down the line, those distinctions don't matter. The only thing that really matters, he says this in his 1976 book, I'm trying to remember the title, Agenda for Biblical People. He says the only distinction that really matters is, are you part of the establishment church or the biblical church? And the biblical church, of course, believes in all the new left ideas. That's Jim Wallace. All right, you have a big biography, more than you bargained for here. Ed Stetzer's written for him, written for his publication multiple times. Evangelicals don't, like conservative evangelicals, don't write for Sojourners. What's going on? So I don't know a lot about Stetzer. I haven't done like a big deep dive, but something is up with that guy if he's accepted in that crowd and he's writing for those guys. So that's why I wonder. I was like, did he influence maybe the Surgeon General? I don't know. I don't have any evidence that says he did. Maybe the Surgeon General influenced him. I don't know, but there's a connection there of some kind. Now, here's what's also being said out there. Christianity Today. It's hard to close black churches amid COVID-19. And, you read the article and basically, we should do it. Yeah. They're not calling for, hey, this lockdown's excessive and maybe churches should be not singled out. Maybe they are essential. The article is basically saying that, we just got to basically check our privilege. We need to understand that it's harder for the black churches during this time. And then here's a few other sources, and there's so many of these, but here's Camilla Harris, here's the Reverend William Barber, both saying the same thing. Look, this horrible situation we're in right now, we can't ignore the underlying reasons why people, especially people of color, have these pre-existing health conditions, and that's what's killing them, is pre-existing conditions. They don't have access, to exercise and healthy food, etc. And it's killing them because, look, obesity is one of the biggest pre-existing conditions. If you have, I'm trying to remember now, diabetes. There we go. It was on the tip of my tongue. If you have diabetes, that's a huge pre-existing condition that could be the difference between life or death if you get this. And so they're saying that these lifestyle choices really aren't choices. They're the results of the environment we live in, and that environment was shaped by, and you're going to find once this gets rolling, it's white supremacy's fault again. And so we got to be prepared for that. So how do we become prepared for that? And here's one of the first things I want to mention to you. Here's a disparity you're not going to hear about too much, but to NPR's credit, they talked about it back on April 8th. Women are doing better than men. I'm going to read for you a quote. People started noticing this almost as soon as the first clinical reports came out of the Wuhan describing the cases in China. There was one large study that looked at nearly 40,000 cases, and it found that the fatality rate was higher for men. It was 2.8% for men compared to only 1.7% for women. And that's basically held true as the virus has moved to other countries. Like in Italy, there was this one study of 1,500 cases of critically ill people with the virus who were admitted into the ICUs, the intensive care units, and about 80% of them were men. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. So men are doing much worse than women. Are we going to talk about all the problems, that the stress that men have, and all the situations that led to men dying at higher rates than women? And then are we going to talk about solutions? I mean, we got to redistribute some income here. We got to give more resources. We got to make more things available. Are we going to do any of that? Or do we just not talk about that? Does that men don't matter? Because they're higher up on the intersectionality pyramid. It's worth asking. If we look at it, we could slice this pie in so many ways. You realize that? If we just want to look at urban versus rural, urban versus suburban. I mean, if you're in a place that has a lot of people around, then you have a greater chance of getting the virus. If you live out on a farm and no one's coming into town, you have less of a chance. Does that mean the farmer now needs to give to those in the city through the government, not his own charity, mind you, but the government needs to come and steal or take from that farmer. I mean, what other disparities can we come up with? I mean, I'm sure there's probably tons. If we start really analyzing all the data, children seem to be doing much better than elderly people. I mean, do we need to take their allowance now so we can give it to those? I mean, how far do you take this? And they're so selective about the disparity that they want to use. It's an agenda, guys. This isn't this as good as their intentions may be on some of this. There's an agenda driving this because they arbitrarily choose what communities they want to assist in this, and the ones that aren't on politically correct to assist, they don't have any interest in. Now, I want to talk a little bit about Russell Moore and what he's been up to lately. I know I mentioned, I think it was 2 episodes ago, that he's really beating the drum hard for this whole government loans going to the church. Hey, if you're a church, you should feel comfortable with it. It's fine. There's no strings attached. And my response is essentially, there's always strings attached. There's always dependency you're setting up. You're looking now to the government to save you instead of God. We see this happening, and I wish I had the figures to pull up right now. I know I have them saved somewhere, but we see this happening with Christian education in general. Once you start accepting government loans for that, you become dependent. You need the government loans. You have to abide by regulations, and that's one of the scary things is moving forward. You have a Democratic administration. You have Democrats controlling Congress, and you're going to get some hate legislation passed that is going to essentially change the discrimination policies that schools need to enact in order to receive the government loans and funding. And when churches start taking money from the government, like directly, in the form of a loan, and supposedly, and I don't know, I've heard different things, supposedly the loan's supposed to be forgiven, etc. Well, either way, you start setting up the government as the place that, not only bails out big businesses, as we found out after the 2008 crash, but now they're going to bail out churches. They're going to bail out individuals. They're going to bail out everyone, even though it's our money. If you're going to start doing that, then you're shifting the culture of individuals and churches into expecting that the next time something like this happens, and there will be a next time, that the government's just got to come in and save us. And you don't think there's going to be strings attached? You don't think the next Democratic administration is not, they're going to forget who took money? I've heard, and I don't have a primary source to back this up, but someone I trust told me that just about every Southern Baptist entity and seminary, except 2, has taken money, has applied for money under the CARES Act. So this is where we're heading, guys. It's not a far jump to go from this to being just an entity of the government. Why shouldn't it be like some countries in Europe? Why shouldn't the government just have finance the church? I'm not comfortable with this. I'll be honest with you. And there's probably more I could say, but I just wanted to put it on your radar. Now, here's something else. This is kind of like, this made the waves yesterday. The Evangelical Immigration Table on April 13th put out a letter, and I'm not gonna read this to you, but I'll basically tell you essentially what it says is, hey, because of COVID-19, you need to release some of these illegal migrants that you have waiting. They're detained, waiting to be sorted out. You need to release them. And because they're made in the image of God, it's all the familiar arguments that don't hold any water that we've talked about many times on this podcast. And so Russell Moore, he signed it. And people are saying, why do you handle this religious liberty? I mean, it's literally in the name of ethics and religious liberty. You had one job, religious liberty. Why in the world are you treating the religious liberty issue with kid gloves if you talk about it at all, but you're pounding home that churches need to take government money, or at least feel comfortable with it, and you're somehow have time to lend your voice to support illegal migrants being released during this pandemic? Guys, we don't need an ERLC in the Southern Baptist Convention. In fact, they're doing more damage than anything else. If you're in the SBC and your church is not itemizing their giving, then money's going to the ERLC, and you really need to consider if that's good. Now, I was going to play this for you. I don't have time, but I'll just summarize. Russell Moore was on a show, I think it's 2 weeks ago now, and I think it was The World and Everything in it, and he was asked, What do you think about de Blasio's edict that he would shut down a church permanently or a place of worship if they didn't close? And Russell Moore basically said, well, it's unfortunate he said that. And you compare the language Russell Moore uses for something like that, which is egregious, to what he said, I think it was in 2015 with the mosque issue. And he was adamant, that Muslims are made in the image of God and that this is something that ERLC needs to be behind. And you hear Russell Moore when he talks about racism and how adamant he is. It's demonic. It's evil. He uses absolute language. And then something that is about religious liberty, a threat to religious liberty, literally his job, well, it's unfortunate. And so I was going to make that point that something's wrong with this guy and the organization that he represents. And so, speaking of separating families, I know a guy who also wants to separate families. Russell Moore is very concerned about families being separated on the southern border. Well, here's something that we should be more concerned about, but again, hardly anyone's talking about it.
Most of the transmission that's actually happening in many countries now is happening in the household, at family level. In some senses, transmission has been taken off the streets and pushed back into family units. Now we need to go and look in families to find those people who may be sick and remove them and isolate them in a safe and dignified manner.
So how are you going to do that? How are you going to find which family members are sick? Well, the government would have to go in forcibly, perhaps, even to do that. And then once you're in there and find the sick family member, you separate them out and quarantine them somewhere else. So you'll have to have facilities for that. Someone's paying for that. And this is the horror, isn't it, that evangelicals at the evangelical immigration table decry. You can't separate families. That's wrong. That's a sin because people are made in the image of God. That's the argument. They're made in the image of God. You can't deport them. You can't separate them. But here we have a spokesman, some kind of representative for the World Health Organization talking about this. And Donald Trump, to his credit, wants to defund the World Health Organization. In the last 2 days, liberals have been very upset about this and thinking, well, we're in the middle of a pandemic. You can't do that. When the reality is, these are the guys that got China wrong. They said China had it under control. And now we get this nonsense. Why wouldn't you defund that organization? Now, I don't know to what extent that this has been implemented or tried to be implemented. I don't know if countries in Europe have thought about doing this. I couldn't see this being done in the United States, but then again, there's a lot of things happening right now I couldn't see happening in the United States that are happening right in front of me. So all that to say, evangelicals that care about the immigration issue and separating families is their battle cry don't seem to be saying much about this. And you'd think they would be if they were going to be consistent. So I want to point that out. Now, an evangelical pastor who I wanted to highlight for you because he's a listener of the Conversations That Matter podcast, and I'm just so proud that he did this, but he is a pastor, and he was on the news recently. His name is Matthew Cook, and here is what he had to say.
A weekly tradition for millions, and it's considered an essential activity under Governor Bill Lee's executive stay-at-home order. It's a designation Pastor Matthew Cook is pleased with.
It would be a violation of the First Amendment and our God-given rights to peaceably assemble and to worship. No law should be made preventing the respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof.
While he plans to have church, he also plans to follow health guidelines, asking members to sit at least 6 feet apart and to avoid shaking hands. He sees church as no more risky or less essential than going to the grocery store.
We've told people don't come if you're sick at all, don't come. If you have any autoimmune disorders or if you're over 60 and you're concerned, please don't come. Or if you're just scared.
He also doesn't believe the government should be able to take those choices away. LMU law professor Stuart Harris explains it's an ability they have during an emergency.
In normal times, it would be extraordinary for any governor to lock down the state or forbid travel, and likely would violate one or more constitutional rights. But these are not ordinary times. And in extraordinary times when the public health is at risk, governors like Governor Lee have extraordinary powers.
And in these extraordinary times, This pastor says he's glad to be preaching.
Whether you die from coronavirus or whether you die from some other cause, one day you're going to die. And to spread the message that there's hope beyond this life, beyond the grave, is worth it to me.
In Knoxville, Blake Stevens, WATE 6 on your side.
Matthew, excellent job. Couldn't have said it better. I'm glad you're out there. Keep it up. This was from last week, right before Easter, that recording. And just thankful to have folks like Matthew in the audience. I wanted to juxtapose what the lawyer said in that video with what Chuck Baldwin was going to say, but I actually just received a phone call from Chuck Baldwin's office, and I'm not sure what's going on. Maybe you can pray for them. But apparently an emergency of some kind came up. So I'm going to have to reschedule Pastor Baldwin, and we will get into the Constitution and Romans 13 and all of that stuff at some point, but it won't be today. So sorry to get your hopes up at the beginning of the video. Didn't mean to do that, but emergencies do come up. I know my father's a pastor, and I've seen that happen many times, and told the office. I called back, left a message, said that I would pray for them with whatever's happening. So to wrap things up here, we do have anti-Christian bigotry being continued. I gave some examples of this last episode, but we have more going on. Many of you have probably heard of some of these examples. The Mississippi pastor that his congregation was fined for going to a drive-in service, he's going to sue. You have Louisville, Kentucky, and I mentioned that earlier. Al Mohler was upset about that. They were forbidding people to do drive-in services for Easter. The Kentucky governor, anyone at mass gatherings this weekend must quarantine. So if you go to church, you got to quarantine. And of course, again, we've made the point that we don't make up these rules for going to Lowe's or going to the Walmart or going to even Planned Parenthood or the liquor store. I mean, it specifically seems to be, for the most part, tailored. It's a category of personal get-together, so like parties, things that aren't essential, right? A birthday party is not essential, but somehow church gets put into that category as not essential, and that's wrong. That's a clear telltale sign that we've gone secular. Now, here's one that you probably haven't heard of. This is Governor Andrew Cuomo in New York. This is his stay-at-home order, his recent one. He's issued like 3. This is the recent one. All non-essential gatherings of individuals of any size for any reasons. Okay, listen to that. Individuals of any size, so 2 people, right? For any reason. So if you and one other person want to gather for any reason, worship services, parties, celebrations, or other social events are canceled or postponed. I mean, does this mean that if you have a date with your girlfriend, it's canceled or postponed? I mean, the governor of Michigan was doing something like this, right? Where you can't go to someone else's house, even a family relative's house, something like that. All right, New York State this is draconian. Congregate services within houses of worship are prohibited. So you can't go to a house of worship. Houses of worship may only be used by individuals and only where appropriate social distancing of at least 6 feet between people can be maintained. That's contradictory. I don't even understand what that means. So you can't gather, but now you're saying that in a house of worship, it can only be used by individuals and only where appropriate social distancing is in place. Further, individuals should not gather in houses of worship, homes, or other locations for religious services. So if you had the dream of getting together at a little house church, you can't do that either. So it doesn't matter if you're not in the church building, if you are in your home gathering. He by the way, he released this right after Passover Seder. So his Jewish base, he's a Democrat, his Jewish base, they're not going to be as mad at him because they were able to have Passover. But he released it right before, of course, Resurrection Sunday, Good Friday. Oh my goodness. This is the kind of thing that drives pastors nuts, because what are they supposed to do with this? It's contradictory. It's draconian. Each department can probably interpret it any way they want, each barracks for the state troopers. It's crazy. It is so crazy. And man, I'm glad that Hillary Clinton is not the president of the United States right now, because I can't imagine what the attorney general would be doing. As it is, fortunately, we have an attorney general that, even though I don't like I don't think it's right for the federal government, the national government, to get involved in state issues. That should be a state thing. But let's be honest, we know that those precedents have been set. It's wrong. It shouldn't happen. But because we live in this brave new world where the modern state runs everything, I'm just glad it's someone like Bob Barr instead of whoever Hillary Clinton would have appointed, because these things would stand in place, and I think we lose religious liberty. I mean, at least this can be challenged in court somehow. So that's all I have for you today. Just wanted to share that, and like I said, there's a big video coming. Stay tuned for that. I think it's going to open your eyes a little bit, and it's really going to add some new information that you may not have realized before. So look forward to seeing you next time. I hope this video was helpful, and hopefully, even though it's a bit of a rant, hopefully it encouraged you a little. You're not alone. Government overreach is something that many of us are concerned about. In fact, I'll tell you a quick story, even though I'm wrapping up here. I was at I'm not going to say where. I was at a barbecue joint, and I actually, okay, I'll back up. This story is actually pretty good. This is a personal story, so you may enjoy this. I've taken to trying to ride my bike a little more because you can't go to the gym right now, and I have an issue with my foot that running is really tough. So I've been trying to ride my bike. Well, I've broken down 3 times in the last week. So the first time I broke down, I put these new pedals on and these new shoes. I've never tried that before. And in the middle of a thunderstorm comes up. I'm actually riding on fields, and the bike pedal comes off in my shoe. If they're connected, and I'm running, and it's connected to my shoe. I'm running with the bike, trying to find cover, and I sort of found cover at this Methodist church, kind of like underneath the front. There was a little overhang. So that was the first instance. And fortunately, somehow a contractor came into the parking lot after the storm passed. I caught the edge of it. It wasn't bad. It looked like it was going to be bad, and then it wasn't. And but he had an Allen key, and I was able to put the pedal back on. And then second time was last Saturday, and I spent 4 hours basically trying to patch a tire on my bicycle, which is ridiculous. It's almost embarrassing that I mentioned this, but the reason it took that long was because I didn't have a bicycle patch. All I had was I was next to an auto parts store, and I had a tire patches for a big tire that would go on a car, and I'm trying to use that to patch my bicycle tire, and it's just way too big, and I don't have any tools. And I tried everything imaginable to get this tire back up and running, and it wasn't working. And I was able to get the leak slow enough that I could get home. But while I was there, by the way, that story doesn't end. I have another piece to tell you. but while I was there was a barbecue place across the street, and of course it's next to a grocery store. It's like a Food Lion or something. See, that narrows it down for people who want to know where this is, I guess. It's backed out onto the street, the line. That's how many people are going to Food Lion. And so in my neck of the woods, the roads are more crowded now during the day than they were before the pandemic. I don't know where everyone's going, but the social distancing thing isn't working because everyone's now in the Petri dishes of Food Lion and Walmart, and or they're out on hiking trails, I guess, or I don't know where they're going, but it's busy. The traffic's busy. And everyone was lined up. The line's going on the street. Well, right next to that line is this barbecue place, and there's a sign that says open. And I'm thinking, what place is open? So I walk in, and there's a guy sitting there eating, and I'm like, and there's no sign. So I walk up, and I'm like, well, I'd like to get a sandwich. And I talked to the guy running the place, and I said, so if 10 people come in here, do you have to, tell one of them to leave? And he kind of pauses, and then I just said, is that how it works? Because he wasn't answering me. He was looking down. And he looks up at me and he goes, yes, comrade. And I said, oh, I take it you don't care for what's going on. And he started ranting about, the communists that are, taking over this country, and there's no personal responsibility left and all that. And so I told my wife later, and we haven't done this and we probably won't, but I told her later, I said, hey, if you want to go out to a restaurant, I know one that's still open. Anyway, so, and then last night, I'm on my bicycle, and it just the chain, the piece that holds the chain, I forget the name of it. It just it breaks in half for no reason. So those are my adventures. But anyways, hope that was helpful, and God bless.